Good day, and thank you for joining us here at Performance Engineering and Your End User. I am thrilled to be able to introduce this webinar today. And again, to do that, I would like to highlight that this is being brought to you by the Vivit Performance Engineering SIG. Again, there's a number of us that work within this organization as both champions and leaders. Chris, if you could forward the slides for me. And within here, you'll see that we've got myself, Todd Bicapua, we have Petar Puskarich, we have Paul Shavlin, and Chris Trimper, that for almost a year now, we've worked together to lead this group into what has become the fastest growing special interest group that there is within Vivit worldwide. We now have well over 7,000 members. Again, if you're interested in learning more about Vivit worldwide, here's the URL that you can use or that you can share with your friends. Go to the next slide. This is hosted by myself. I have the opportunity to work at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise as a Chief Technology Evangelist, and also Chris Trimper, who's the Manager of QA and Engineering at Independent Health in the Buffalo, New York area. I am joined by a set of panelists today, both Mohit Verma, who is the Senior Architect of Quality Management Services at Tufts Health Plan, and a little bit more on Mohit, because I think as you get to know him, you're going to understand why his passion in this space is so important for this call and, again, for many other areas. So Mohit is a performance engineering evangelist at Tufts Health Plan, currently leading the enterprise performance engineering activities, which he created in 2006. He's been at Tufts now for about 10 years. He has a lot of deep knowledge and expertise in the Mercury, HP, and HPE tools, as well as some open source. He's had the opportunity to work in various domains, including security, performance, development. He's also currently a leader within the Vivit New England chapter. Thank you, Mohit, for joining us today as a panelist. I'd also like to introduce Lisa Andrew. Lisa is with Royal Caribbean Cruises, and she's actually been there for almost 20 years, which I find hard to believe. And seeing Lisa's picture and also knowing her, it's hard to believe she's been working anywhere for 20 years. Most of her time at Royal Caribbean has been in the IT department in QA. Performance testing teams is where she's had the opportunity to work, as well as lead, where she is, again, currently a senior engineer, system integration and performance. Most of her time is being spent on shoreside and a couple shipboard new builds. We were sharing some interesting stories where she's had the opportunity to travel to some fairly remote locations in the world for some of these shipboard new builds. And she's also the technical lead and team lead for performance testing. She's been in IT the whole time, mostly in testing, developed many applications, one she calls a buffet of applications, and is also the testing lead for Royal Caribbean. Lisa, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. Thank you.
And lastly, Chris Trimper, again, the Manager of QA and Engineering from Independent Health, will be working today as a panelist as well, both helping to lead the conversation and injecting some of his thoughts and expertise that he's learned over the years and also at Independent Health. Chris, thank you again for being a leader of this SIG as well as volunteering to be a panelist today. Just a few housekeeping items. This is a live session. It is being recorded. These recordings are available to all Vivit members. And just as a reminder, it's free to be a Vivit member. So again, if you already are, which if you were listening to this, that means you are, please go ahead and share that information with your friends. And we would love to be able to get this type of information out to them in the community so that we can continue to share and learn. We will be holding a session Q&A at the end. However, in the interim, please type any questions that you have in the questions pane. On the next slide, you will see what this questions pane looks like within the webinar control panel. Again, this is a very simple and easy way that any questions you have, please type them in. If we do not have time to cover all of them at the end of this session, what we do is afterwards we post a PDF of the deck that we're using to lead this discussion, as well as a replay of this webinar, and also any and all Q&A that came in through the session with those answers for you. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Chris Trimper. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Todd, for those great introductions for all of us today. So today we're talking about performance testing, performance engineering, and your end user. As many would think, without the users, we really wouldn't have a purpose or anything to test. So we've divided this up into 4 key areas, defining our users, different considerations that we have for representing our users in testing, the impacts, and the various dimensions in turn, including functionality and performance and usability of that testing we need to do. First, I'd like to start off with a quote that I read in a actually newly published book. If any of you follow Todd or Shane Evans, you'll know that the two of them authored a book together recently titled Effective Performance Engineering. And the quote that I found says, "The point is, it shouldn't matter whether your servers can handle 1,000 hits a second or if CPU is below 80%. If the experience of the end user is slow or unreliable, the end result should be considered a failure." I think this statement really clearly helps illustrate the point that we want to get to today, that the end user experience is as much of a factor as anything else in our performance engineering stories. And we want to take a moment today to share with you some experiences and thoughts around that. If anyone's interested in more information about the book, or for a limited time there is a free PDF offering at effectiveperformanceengineering.com/getthebook. And this link will be available in the slide deck that's shared after this session. A real quick mention about your end user, and it's something that, if you don't take a moment to think about it, or if you're focused on one side of the house versus the other, is, the end user really is all over the place. The end user is on campus, they're off campus. They have devices, cell phones, you have web applications, desktop applications, maybe you have mobile applications. There are so many factors that go into this that the end user can use and various areas where they can be impacted by performance. And that's what we're going to look at today. So I want to start off just by identifying everywhere the end user can be and everywhere and anywhere that they are. We have 2 quick poll questions so that we can understand our audience just a little bit better. So Emery, I'd like you to launch our first question about knowing your end user.
It's open now.
Great, thank you, Chris. So for poll number 1, how well do you feel you know your end user? And again, please just select one of these. The first option, I fully understand my end users. I somewhat understand my end users. I do not understand my end users. I have never even used our applications. So again, there's 4 options for you. I encourage you all to vote quickly. We're going to go ahead and watch these come in, and when we reach a certain threshold, we'll go ahead and close it out and show the results. Again, these are the first of 2 quick polls. Of course, I'm really looking forward to seeing what these results are. Just let her go here another moment. Here we go. So as you can see in the results, we've got a very strong leader in the way of I somewhat understand my end users at 67%, then followed by 22% of I fully understand my end users, and at 11% I do not understand my end users. Chris, you will be happy to know that 0% selected I have never even used our applications. So let's go to our second poll, We're going to do 2 of these back to back fairly quickly. So as we launch that, how do you use what you know about your end user? Again, there's 3 options here. Please select one. Knowledge of my end user directly orchestrates my tests. Or number 2, I have just begun integrating end user scenarios to my tests. And lastly, I've not yet integrated any end user findings into my tests. So I have knowledge of it and it directly orchestrates, just begun, or have not yet started using my end users' behaviors into my tests. Again, 1 quick question, 3 quick options. Please select one, and we will display the results here in a moment. All right, so here are the results for everyone. And as you can see, it's 78% is the lead of knowledge of my end user directly orchestrates my tests. 17% have just begun, and 6% saying that they have not yet integrated these end user behaviors into their tests. So I guess, Chris, those are the 2 poll results. I know that we often take an opportunity to reflect on these, and as we look at these 2 results, again, on the first one, how well do you feel you know your end user? 67% saying I somewhat understand my end users. And then on the second question, how do you use what you know about your end user? The majority are a little over 78% saying knowledge of my end user directly orchestrates my tests.
Wow, that's fantastic. We have a lot of people that are well along their way to having a solid performance engineering practice in their workplace. I'd like to give a moment to both our panelists to talk about it and maybe even share where you are in your understanding and usage of your end user. For this, Mohit, I'd like to start with you. Quick moment on your reflection of the results.
Yeah, sure. So I think I kind of also fall in place with pretty much everybody out there. So I think 67% in SOB also kind of very user-based, as much information you can get about the end user, whether from logs, tools. You know, right now we're looking at logs mostly. It's a user agent tells you a lot of that information in the browser. And then also, we also use that information to building our tests because it's really important to limit real production tests. You know, I mean, you cannot be perfect, but I think having that information helps you protect and present good results to your business. You know, that we are using real data that's out there, and we built up tests based on that, and we're testing based on that for a projection in the future, maybe, or for existing performance considerations.
Well, that's great, and I agree. You know, use what you have. It's a wealth of knowledge that you have in your company, and you know, use it to the best of your ability for sure. Lisa, I'd like to hear from you for a quick moment, if we could.
Sure. In our organization, you know, we have many different types of end users, as you mentioned before, and we have some constraints where those end users, and whether they're on or off campus or whatever type of device they might be leveraging for the experience, those are constantly changing and evolving based on new features that are being added or just change in traffic patterns, you know, shifting more to the device, the digital section. So what we do is we have monitoring, you know, production monitoring tools that we leverage, a lot of the solid factual type information, but then we also engage on the business side, you know, making sure we're aligned with what the business is expecting, experiencing, and also advertising. And that drives a lot of our user traffic, you know, user and data usage.
Excellent, thank you. And I'd like to go deeper into this, looking at the considerations for your user. There's really 4 key areas that we noticed that we have to have various considerations, and those are, you know, the different scenarios, coupled with the scenarios, the data, and, you know, hearing from all of you that are listening in, it sounds like you're definitely making the most of the data that's available to you, and both Mohit and Lisa as well, so that your scenarios not just go through the steps that are necessary to represent the users, but are doing it in a meaningful way. And if I could guess, when you're Royal Caribbean, is it just a person? Is it a full family? Are you doing a full package? Are you doing a simple thing? I'll be honest, I've never been on a cruise ship, so I can't even guess. But definitely understanding the healthcare space, the line we use here all the time is a claim is not a claim is not a claim. They're all different. Every claim is different. And how do you represent that vast selection of possibilities? And understanding your data is huge there. As Lisa touched upon, form factor and presentation is a big deal as well, as we're going more and more deeper into the digital age and more companies embracing that. And us that are in the back end supporting all of that in whichever way we do, trying to figure out how in the world do we support something that used to be 1 or 2 options is now 20, 30, 40, 50 options. So let's start looking at the user scenarios. And I'd like to offer up to both Lisa and Mohit talking about a scenario that you have and how understanding your user helps make that scenario better. I have a very simple illustration on the screen of a purchase, not necessarily meant that we're going to discuss this scenario, but just to kind of drive the idea of the different phases of a scenario. This time, Lisa, let's start with you if we could take a moment and discuss that.
Sure. When we're detailing out user scenarios, part of the performance modeling phase when we're involved in a project is we're trying to understand exactly what the processes are and how they're connected and what the end state would be. So when you're looking at that example and we're chaining these requests and making them logical, we're also having to look at the time being spent on those pages. What is the user experience actually representing? So of course, think, time, and pacing are going to be considered in that algorithm. So when we take scenarios and we're developing what you might be familiar with, a load test or a stress test type scenario, we're also embedding in these scenarios the type of traffic patterns that they're going to be coming into from a geographic location. So that's one thing that we found in production is we'll see different geographic patterns based on the country that they're coming from. Say China, traffic is going to be completely different in functionally than you would find in North American traffic. So that's an aspect that we had to ensure that we had the correct scenarios developed and representing those users.
Well, that's an incredible amount of detail, and I might go on record in saying I'm fairly happy that I have a very regional company that does not have the worldwide considerations that you may have. But that's quite impressive. Mohit, yourself, sir?
Yeah, hi. So I think I'm in the same category as you, so TUPS is basically a regional company also. I mean, we do have partners across the country, so we do have end users, but the proportion of them is probably not as big as what Lisa's team has. So most of our user scenarios, we work with the business analysts, come up with like the 80-20 rule, means that that's it's an old philosophy, but it still works a lot. And we kind of follow that to get our main transactions and workflow sitting down with the business analyst, sometimes having them record the script for us, So we have the recorder, we use LoadRunner, so we have the recorder running on their machine, and they record the script for us while we're sitting with them. So that kind of gives us a real script. That's a real scenario with some real think times in there, how they'll be working, and that sometimes we just give it to them as well. And we've done that in the past. Just actually install the tool and have them install it. And often enough, we sit with them and get these requirements. And since we're in healthcare, so a lot of the requirements are with the claims adjudication, how particularly submitting claims, submitting pre-registration, submitting member out-of-pocket information. So a couple of typical high-profile transactions are member out-of-pocket. That's what our member site is, and that's the one we kind of expose to end user in the sense of like we have a mobile website for the last couple of years now that we have been testing regularly for the last 3 years, and LoadRunner has been a great tool for us there. So we've been using that for scripting and testing. So that's kind of impressed and given us a lot of buy-in to our business community, because people didn't even know that we could actually test this when this was deployed 3 years ago. And we have been really good, and I think it's given us a lot of visibility as well as the company, and also within the company, to upper management. And I think the user scenarios are critical, because that's what's going to dictate your performance testing. So I think it's just having the scenarios, the number of users you expect to be on the system, how often will they use the system, what the peak hour is. So that's what we take the information into the picture. And right now, unfortunately, we don't have a production monitoring tool. That's something hopefully will change, but I'm not going to say anything on that more. But so right now, you're mostly looking at logs and some analytics, and hopefully you can get some better analytics in the future, which will give us like end user performance, plus also what kind of hits and usage we get. I'm actually looking forward to the new Performance Center version, which has a PAL piece in it, which actually looks at logs and builds scripts for you from the literally reverse engineering user scenario from that. So that's something that I'm kind of keen on, and I'm not sure if anybody else knows about those, but that would be a kind of an interesting way to build your scripts, So that would be, I'm looking forward to working with that.
Yeah, most certainly. I too have been looking forward to where the industry as a whole, including everything that HP is doing, is really trying to keep up with the trends and making it so that we can do things better. And back to both of your quick stories on this, I like how the two of you touched upon that there are different approaches required for internal and external types of user scenarios. And that the good news is that there are lots of wonderful tricks and utilities and tools that you can use to properly understand your external users. And your internal users, the benefit is they are working with you day to day, and you can walk up to them and you can interface with them and understand their scenarios face to face, whereas a customer you cannot, but there are just excellent tools to help you with that. My story is very similar to Mohit, so I won't bore anybody with it. I'd kind of like to jump ahead to talk about the test data itself and how we determine the proper test data. Because as we slightly touched upon, that test data is really what makes those scenarios worthwhile. Those scenarios are your building blocks, but the test scenarios is really the data for the test scenarios is really what makes them shine. A couple of considerations that I have anytime is, how do you properly represent the end user, and how do you really understand the representation is correct? And I might be stealing a little bit of the points that were made prior, but they are all very valid in that we have so many logs that we can work with. Especially if you have an in-house developed application, I always encourage working with the development teams or the folks that own those tools to better understand things. Many times even if they haven't thought about adding a particular type of logging activity or monitoring or something, it should be very easy for them to integrate it in there to help you better understand things. I know we do that quite a bit here, even at our service layer, so that we can log all sorts of details about the services, how they're used, where they're called from, and really we can map out the full usage of our services so that we can better understand what consuming apps they're coming from, and it allows us to really test at all levels. Mohit, I'd like to come back to you on the test data. I know as well as being in healthcare that test data is difficult for so many levels, both privacy and security things, as well as there's just so many combinations of things out there. And frankly, being a tester, being an expert on all that kind of data is very difficult, and how you deal with that.
No, I totally agree with you. So it means that test data is always a challenge. And on your performance testing, you're all data-driven testing. It doesn't matter what tool you use. So it means that that's been a challenge, and it's actually gotten worse because now we have mass data in our testing environment, which is not really a 1-to-1 ratio from production to test. So in the sense of like when you're masking, you're kind of bucketing in some things. You're bucketing in names and things like that. So that kind of skews some of the testing. So that's unfortunately a risk that the healthcare companies, I'm not sure how they're going to get over it. So because the privacy issue is major, it's the biggest there is. And I don't know any other industry that has such a problem. So means that we try to get the best data we have. We have a set of goal data in some cases that we use for every test, and so we've done that in the past. Right now, I don't think we're following that model as much because data is changing. So data is very complicated, like you said, Chris. Like we have so many different kind of members, different sets of claims, and the number of kind of person. So in healthcare means a claim could have like 100, 200 lines. So each line could be a different attribute in your database. It could be a different kind of a procedure, code, or something like that. So it's very hard to kind of look at exact production data. So, I mean, right now, things we get data from production, but it gets massed into a test environment. And then we try and take a sampling. We take a huge sampling of the data, because the database is massive. Because of compliance and stuff, we have to keep a lot of data in a database. So because of that, we actually have to take a subset of that, but we hope that's a good sampling. And in many cases, that's worked okay. So like we have large text files that we use for load testing. I think I probably want to look at that VTF model at some point in time that's been around to sort of help us with that. But we use a lot of heavy data in our testing that's end user specific. Sometimes we also, and we do a lot of testing with manual testing. We are actually running a load test, just to make sure the end user performance is actually realistic, because load test is just a synthetic tool, right? So it means the test data we're giving it, and then we use the same kind of data in real life and run some tests and to make sure the performance is what we need it to be. And we'll use all the kind of boundary value conditions as well. Somebody who has 1,000 claims, somebody who has 1,000 referrals in the system for some reason. So we do kind of test those scenarios. But selecting the data is very important, because the end user test is kind of materialistically different. If you kind of use the average case, you'll never see those boundary conditions and what they do to your system. And the same thing goes when you talk about test data. Means I guess end user test data is also important, because each of those persons come from a different kind of network, right? So you need to be able to emulate remote workers plus in-office workers, plus people working over Wi-Fi all over the world, right? So how are you going to do that? Means that in the past I've used some open source tools. I've also used network virtualization from HPE for that. And that's been, I think, the integration with the new last 2 years, it was a year and a half ago when HPE bought Shinra. The integration is really easy, and I think there's a couple of free licenses that you throw in even. So I think, I don't see why people should be using that for all the testing. So if they're able to show that to their end users, you can probably tell them that this system, if it's for one user I ran it for such a slow speed, and my system kind of didn't handle it. I'll tell you one scenario, talking about this thing, about mobility. So we had a problem in production, and we were also trying to mimic that in QA. So we actually ran a load test, and by accident, we had about 2% of our users that were mobile users, running at very slow speed. And what happened was that it actually crashed our firewall, kind of thing. So our firewall was not able to handle connections, because the mobile users have different kind of usage, and they hold on to connections much longer. So it actually crashed the system, and it took us a while to debug that problem. And so that was a pretty interesting find, and that kind of brings down the criticality of performance and how your end user behaves, and what impact it could have in your testing and test results.
Oh, absolutely. And I'd like to share two things on that. One is you mentioned those very large data sets, and whenever I do performance testing, I usually keep what I consider poison data, because there's always going to be some percentage of transactions or user scenarios that are going to run in the real world, and they're not going to run as optimally as you want them, because they're just those weird edge cases. But always being able to try to find those and understand those and track them is great. But yeah, the data is massively important, and I find that a thing that's very important when working with test data is not forgetting about communication and making sure that you have open communication with individuals. Many times here, because of all that communication, because of all that knowledge that we've kind of sucked in for our performance engineering here, a lot of folks turn to us for, within the IT organization, understanding of these business processes. Because for better or worse, we've had to learn them to the best of our abilities the scenarios, the data, and just understanding that user and how to represent them. And we've inadvertently become, a higher-end knowledge of all that user information. We have a lot of other really great things to talk about. I'd like to give Lisa a chance to talk about test data because I'm very interested in, in that whole world of what is Royal Caribbean, of how in the world do you manage test data, especially for performance testing.
It can be a challenge, right? And data is so crucial because if you do not have the right data set, you can make or break your performance test. We've seen it, multiple times. One thing that we do as part of the performance modeling phase when we engage in new projects or enterprise level projects and even enhancements, right? What we're looking at with the architects and really our database admins is we engage them and we make sure they're part of the process for performance modeling. So when we're looking at new tables that are being introduced or new processes that drive data to those tables, we need to make sure that they're doing their diligence and having their own sizing exercise. So we want to know a year from now what that table is going to look like because that's what we want to test under, right? And the same thing with when we're running, middle tier, we tend to do bottom-up type performance testing. Our approach is if we have a new application, right, we're focusing in on each layer, and then we're building up to that end layer, that end-to-end layer, and then we're also validating. But part of that is what you were mentioning a minute ago regarding the size of the data throughput, and those edge cases. Those are extremely important because sometimes functional testing doesn't catch it, but you'll notice when you're performance testing, you'll catch a lot of those functional issues that really the functional side can't generate with their tools. So that's also important, those edge cases, to try to consider it, even if it's with resiliency type testing when you're running tests. Our environment, we're lucky, we actually have our environment matching production size data. And that's so important because, we have 51 ships and we have, 6,000 sailings. So you can imagine all the data that's attached to those, whether it's tours, shore excursions, air gateways, etc. So that is extremely important for us to test with that data set, the same thing I was mentioning before with performance modeling. So we're actually trying to bring the most realistic, so we're trying to mitigate the risk when we go to production and we're not testing with the same data set. We had tried using VTS. We weren't very successful. We found some latency issues. So that was something that we kind of stepped away from because we also do, we tend to be data stewards for people. So we'll actually we work with QA and we develop data too, right? So obviously we have the tools, so we help generate new builds. So you have a brand new ship that's going to be launched, like the Ovation or Harmony. So what you're doing is they're testing, 25 voyages. So we go out and we help build their data for that new build scenario to do their functional testing and, of course, our performance testing. So a very interesting topic.
Yeah, and I just had a light bulb go off at the top of my head wondering how in the world I didn't have any slides or any discussion points on the fact that a lot of times, whether it's functional or performance, that whole automation realm, that ability to mass do things, we do end up ending up being somewhat of a data steward, which I think just really helps everyone except for ourselves when it comes to time management. It really helps out everyone and really solidifies the importance of that sort of a team. As much as test data is one of my favorite topics for user-based understanding of performance, I don't want to forget about some other pieces. And Lisa, you mentioned that you have all kinds of form factors and just delivery systems for all that is Royal Caribbean. And I'd love for you to be able to share with us a little bit. For me right now, we mostly have internal applications and web, but you have a plethora of other things. And I feel like every day you have a lions and tigers and bears oh my moment when you look at all the stuff out there. And I'd just love to hear how you manage that and just keep it awesome.
Great. Yeah, on the there's actually an interesting application that we have on board the ship, right? And I was talking when I was at Discover. I was talking to some of the architects with HP, and they hadn't considered these scenarios because they kept talking about on cloud versus on-prem, and I was like, we have to understand, for us, our ships are on-premise, right? Because they're encapsulated units. So we have this very interesting application called Royal IQ. So you go on a cruise, you're at the embarkation desk, and you download this application, you log into it, and right there you're seeing that you can book your short excursions or change your dining for that night or see your itinerary for the cruise before you even get on the ship. You're able to create those reservations if you wanted to, and you can also chat with your friends on board. You can also track, because we use RFIDs, on your wrist to kind of track, get you into your cabin or charge your Starbucks coffee, or the kids get scanned in as they go into the kids program. So we can actually use Royal IQ to track where a person is if they want it enabled on that device. So this covers all devices. And one thing that we found is on these different mobile devices, whatever they might be, when you're using it on board the ship, it's very interesting to try to test that from a performance testing perspective, but it's all on-prem. So we physically have to take our load runner hardware. We have Load Runner Performance Center, and we have to go on board and actually execute this test in these new build environments. There's no access from the World Wide Web. So pretty interesting, challenging scenarios that you face, but you just have to go into it full throttle, and you definitely have HP support typically to help you out with some of these challenges.
Earlier, Lisa, you mentioned you take a bottom-up approach to a lot of your stuff, and with all that is the devices and places that you see the Royal Caribbean experience expanding, do you have an opportunity to go bottom-up there as well? And maybe a word of advice you can give on that?
What we have done there is, it depends on the scenario that's occurring, right? Because everything is different. We're constantly being challenged with, different types of applications. We have web applications, we have internal web applications, we have ICER, mainframe type environments. We have big space on the integration side, and now they're starting to introduce microservices and microflows, which is somewhat performance challenging to us, that architecture. But, and of course you've got your client server applications, right? PeopleSoft, Feeble, et cetera. So within that, from the mobile perspective or those digital devices, what we found is for performance testing, we start off with the application itself. So we're focusing in on that application performance first, whether it's a service that we're focusing on. So we're doing atomic testing at the service level. Then we're kind of bringing that up to more of an integrated test, and then we're bringing that up, adding the front end piece to it. And then when we're doing the actual mobile testing, what we're doing is trying to use the protocol that really emulates that user. We haven't moved into the mobile Performance Center mobile piece yet. What we do is we actually have emulator that we're using, and then we're running that emulator for a true user mobile experience with the mobile clients, but then we're also driving load as well. So we're making sure that environment, that infrastructure is pegged or is at that normal load that it needs to be, but then we're also introducing those real user experience type scripts so we can give the business and an IT an understanding of what the impact is.
That's pretty incredible. And I think if I could find a takeaway for everyone listening or everyone that's going to listen in the future, it would be no matter how big the scenario you're given, you can always break it down and you can do it. Most of us are listening to what you're doing thinking that it's barely insurmountable, but if you can break it down and chunk it up, I think you can definitely pull it off to have this nice orchestrated thing that you do. That's awesome.
Right.
And I would like to take a moment and encourage folks that are listening live, reminder that there is the Q&A panel, and we will get to questions very shortly. And if you have questions about a particular thing, maybe it sounds similar to what you're doing and you want some advice, or you want to know more about something we're talking about, please feel free to ask questions. I do promise we will get to those very shortly. The next thing, something that's a little near and dear to my heart, is really ensuring proper delivery. And a couple examples I have here are real things that I've observed and screenshotted on my own surfing and navigating the web. And these are all examples of things that, in my mind, could happen during one of my performance tests. But depending on how you orchestrate your test, these may go unnoticed to you. Most of these aren't going to return a server 400 message or some kind of odd thing that's going to alert you that it's wrong. And if you're just doing a simple check or a navigation through a particular thing, like that poor Amazon page that you see there, your scripts are going to pass through and not notice it. But again, due to likely performance type issues, there was a very poor user experience, whether it's the unfortunate Marvel experience I had where something went wrong and I wasn't even able to get my content, or the Amazon where it's sort of there but it's a very poor experience, or the unfortunate unhappy bear with Bing and it just wasn't working at all. These are things that are a struggle to figure out how do you cover these things. And Mohit, I'd like to hear if there's something that you're doing today to cover these sorts of things or to be aware of this sort of test issues.
Yeah, first of all, I think, in order, we need to do proper monitoring in production to sort of avoid some of these stages. I'm not sure you can avoid all of them, but, the production monitoring with a good tool out there needs to be done and reviewed, so people sort of have this tool running and make sure that you have the proper alerts set up and everything. But in our case, unfortunately, we don't have this in the production side. So this is another challenge that, as I mentioned earlier, we have some limited testing that we do on some of the pages. But during our performance testing means that what I kind of push everybody to do is we do our manual testing or UFT script, and I also run performance tests when actually the UAT users are on the system. So there are probably 5 or 10 people, real people testing out there. So oftentimes, if there's an issue, they'll see that, even though my scripts didn't see that, or I didn't see it manually, because it's funny. I sit in a cubicle and I have another person on my team who sits on the other side, right? And she gets different network experiences. It's ridiculous, they just sit even though it might be in the same subnet, different subnet, doesn't matter. But oftentimes I see errors, I don't see any errors, and she's seeing all these weird errors from different browsers, right? So we also, the challenge of end user is also the multi-browser testing. So how do you mitigate that problem? Because you have so many different systems, complexity of end user appliances, devices, the move to RWD, responsive web design, that all requires special testing and tools for to make sure that we can actually test those scenarios. It adds a lot of work for performance engineers, because you have to basically model all these different scenarios and test different end users with different devices and different browsers, right? So that means in the healthcare, so I'll tell you that a lot of the providers use iPads out there, and so we have to test for those kind of scenarios as well. We already are mobile. So we've been using a lot of HP2 client stuff, and also the proxy setup, sniffer, we use all those technologies, and done our testing with that. So that's been a really good seller, but I think the complexity is immense, because you have to sort of mitigate all these scenarios, and how do you manage the risk, right? And it's basically risk-based testing. So you can look at all the modern devices, but you don't know since you're regional, we can control that. I'm not sure how Lisa does it, but because most of our users are in the Northeast, so we know that the systems are, most of the people probably have reasonable phones, and so I cannot do a least common denominator testing, so I go to the lowest speed I can test with and see if the system breaks, with that thing that everybody should be giving on mobile speed, whether through Wi-Fi or through the network. And then I go up from there, so where does the system actually break? So I can try to find that. but it is very complicated, and I think avoiding this is a good way to do this is doing a performance testing when you have UAT users also in the system who are actually doing end user testing at the same time. And I know a lot of the other websites, right? Like Amazon only launches parts of. I mean, I'm not sure what the term is called, but it only launches into some users their website new changes, and so I think that's a good approach to go down that road.
Yeah, and I think you touched upon something that I hope most people had a chance to really pull out of your conversation, and that is that the gap between functional testing and performance testing is and should be narrowing. And really, you know, I'm lucky enough that both occur by the same team in my organization, and I have the, I guess you say, privilege to oversee both efforts. And we noticed that having the two efforts kind of converge, you know, really does help us an awful lot, because then you can not only understand the performance of the system, but the overall functionality of the system, building that true ecosystem that ends up being your performance engineering effort that you want to have. And you know, I think that's a very important lesson to learn out of this discussion, that you know, bridging that gap isn't a scary thing, and it's a very, very useful thing to do. You know, Lisa, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this for maybe just a quick moment, as we have a couple other things I'd like to discuss.
Sure. For you know, for us, the primary thing, you know, we do first on the performance scripting side is we want to, you know, on the performance side, you know, on production side, we're using monitoring tools that capture these failures like keynotes. So we're getting tracking information and error messages and dump, and then we're also using Dynatrace. That kind of also will give us the information, exactly what data is being used when the issue occurs. So that's really kind of outside our realm. We're the consumer of that information, but we don't actually engage in the effort on the production monitoring piece. From our side, though, when we're doing performance testing, you know, we're ensuring the scripts that we have, you know, these scenarios that we're being requested to build, we're kind of ensuring that we've got, we build them in a robust fashion, so we're making sure that those pages, if they're getting hit and there's actually errors coming back, we're ensuring that it's a successful script execution process, right? Because that's a big thing you'll see, and I noticed it in Todd's book as well, it mentioned, but the quality of what we're building when we're executing, you know, distinguishes us when we're running a test to make it much more successful. So when we're developing those scripts and then we're validating it, you know, we kind of have a handshake validation with our dev leads on what we've built in the BAs to ensure that what we're being requested is being given, so there's no question about it. One simple thing that you can do when you're executing a test, if you're using, say, a browser-based, you know, application, is I use Firebug. It's a very, you know, an excellent tool to use if you don't have a QA resource that can test alongside of you and kind of validate your testing, your response time, because we get questioned all the time, right? People just can't believe it. Hey, why is my response time 25 seconds? It's not like that on my machine. So we kind of have to validate that with them a lot of times, and we use QA to help us. They're definitely our partners. And besides that, you know, when we're running the test itself, we're making sure that we're getting updates. So we're querying the database to make sure we're getting updates that match the record count. We're ensuring that we're matching the TPS that the monitoring folks are seeing. That kind of helps us. And of course, they're monitoring logs to let us know if they're seeing any challenges. I hope that was quick enough.
Oh, that's great. And you know what, even if we do end up, you know, missing the opportunity to talk about a couple of things, I feel that these main topics on understanding and properly representing the user are so important that it's definitely worth all of this awesome conversation that we're having. And again, it's very nice to see a lot of the different organizations understanding that all these teams need to play together. And I really think that anyone looking for an introduction to their DevOps journey, because that's a very big trend, you know, this is definitely something that can help, that communication, building that, closing those gaps. I'd like to briefly talk about growth and change, because you know, we can't just stay stagnant. We can't just, the tests of today don't necessarily fulfill the needs of, you know, tomorrow, next month, next year. So Lisa and Mohit, if you can just each take maybe a point from each of these and talk about it for a brief moment, and understand maybe one thing that you're doing to anticipate change. Mohit, I'd like to start with you on this.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about technology, right? So, I mean, technology is changing at a crazy pace. That's very hard to keep up with it. So, I mean, the amount of like Angular, Node.js, Express.js, plus all the mobile devices and applications you need to test, plus network conditions, right? So, I mean, keeping up in sync with that, it's very difficult. I mean, I think the HP toolset has done a great job with it. I mean, but it does caution. You mean in the sense of like, if it continues like this, it's like, do you have enough people to test with? Do you have enough people to record your scripts? How much testing can you actually do? Because there'll have to be an element of risk out there that somebody has to accept. And I'm not sure you'll be able to find all the errors, right? So, I mean, the way things are going, it's a little out of control for us, technology-wise. So, I mean, keeping up with it, getting a tool set that actually works in almost all the technologies, and how you can test those in the time you have. Performance engineering sort of still kind of is always put into the end. The agile journey definitely helps with that a little bit, but a lot of corporations are still kind of mixed and mostly waterfall, right? So that happens. You don't have enough time to kind of deal with technology changes and understand how to mitigate those.
Oh, for sure. And I'm a firm believer in carefully managing our time and making sure we can do the best we can. But the biggest thing that we learn here is, if ever there's a mistake in terms of the performance, we do everything we can to make sure we don't make it again. Having the perfect test is very difficult to do, but being aware of all these different areas of change and growth is very important to us. Lisa, earlier when we were chatting, I was talking to you actually at HP Discover. You shared a fun story about how that realm of e-commerce and email campaigns really plays into your planning for change. If you could just in a quick moment share about that, I think that's something that everybody can listen in on and maybe learn from.
Sure. So, in our organization, we have the Royal Caribbean website, celebrity website. So what we see happen is we're basically, getting notified somewhat before we have the actual project. I think this is what you're touching on. When we have the project, getting engaged, what we'll have is the business side, we're a little bit at battle, right? They'll actually set up the email campaign, not before we've even been able to, produce the product. So that happens. It doesn't happen really anymore, but that can be a challenge. So what happened is, we're running performance tests, trying to accommodate the email campaign that came out in that instance. I think that's what you're talking about, right, Chris?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. And I just want to mention on your, anticipating growth. I mean, for us, it's we're actually very fortunate in our group. We're very tied to the architecture team, and they have their excellence group. So they keep us updated. I work with them, continuously, and they're always trying to push the envelope on, edge technology, which is a challenge. So we usually have a heads up, and we start to research it, like with the Angular JS, right? So we're kind of, researching it, knowing, okay, we've got to upgrade, to this level, or we need to put in a support ticket. It helps us from anticipating technology changes coming into play.
Yeah, that communication is absolutely key. Next, the impacts. And really, if you ever have trouble trying to sell what you're doing to upper management, I found that unfortunately, leaning on these kind of impacts of what ifs or what happened when's, hopefully you don't have too many of those, really can help to justify all the efforts that it takes to do and to have a proper performance engineering practice in your organization. Again, a brief moment on the impacts. If Mohit, we can start with you, and just one quick impact that either you are constantly aware of, or that your management is certain that this is your marching order. We make sure that we don't have this particular impact to our organization.
Right. So I think because knowing that every cost is really important, I'll focus on revenue. means good performance engineering is really needed for cost savings, because it sized the environment properly. That means I think upper management always likes to look at that and as a big winner. So I think, and that's also a big seller for performance engineering. I think if your performance engineering team is if you're established as a center of excellence, and you can show very easily that sizing your environment and proper tests, you actually save money, because the company actually saves money in the long run because you don't have your oversized environments. And with the cloud also, it makes things complicated, but you can still test in the cloud. So, and you can make sure you size in the cloud properly, whether you use auto scaling or not, or small instances or not. So I think the biggest seller is really revenue, because most companies look at revenue as a big thing, and obviously competitive advantage probably is not far away.
Well, you covered pretty much all of them. Awesome. Yeah, they are all very interrelated. I'll steal a quick minute and say that, especially in the healthcare space and really any service-oriented organization, our customers have a choice. So as much as a bad experience with the product, in this case healthcare or a cruise ship or whatever it may be, the experience of the, I guess, the tools or accessibility to things. So in our case, if users don't see their benefits, or they can't get in and look at their deductibles, or they want to look at their claim history and they can't do that, or they feel it's a poor experience, those all go into the factors of why they choose our product. So I think that one's a very big one to us, because we do strive to deliver the best experience we can to our customers. Lisa, for you, I'm sure there's other cruise ships out there. I don't necessarily know what they are, as it's not my space, but what are the different impacts if there are poor experiences to your users that you see?
Well, definitely customer retention, right? Because I think the main focus, with Royal Caribbean is customer retention and loyalty. So we try to provide, the best experience possible. So on our ships, they do an awesome job. But if it's at the website and they're not able to figure out how to do their online check-in process, right? Or worst case, they're having latency issues, that's a killer, because we will hear directly about it. And really all those items, are interrelated, right? And it all has an impact against the revenue side. For us in performance testing, obviously we have a revenue impact when we're running our tests. So kind of justifying that goes back to risk analysis for us. So when we're doing planning for performance testing, we're doing a risk assessment. So based on what's been given to us for the objectives, right, or the scenarios, we're also kind of doing some risk analysis there against the actual budget. So ensuring that what we're executing, the number of what we're executing, right, and of course, the resources that we're using, make sense. But to me, the cost of performance or the cost of, customer is very high in that case.
No, that's great to hear. We are almost at the top of the hour, so I'd like to jump ahead to our closing slide and allow time, maybe 2-3 minutes, to go over some questions. I know there's some really great questions from the audience. So just real quick, more information about our SIG. You can find all kinds of information out there. HP has the software performance engineering page. Again, all these links will be in the slide deck that's available to you after this presentation. There's a really fantastic section of Tech Beacon for all kinds of different performance articles. The different blogs for Load Runner and Performance Center are available at this bit.ly link, so bit.ly/HPE-LRPC blog. And then lastly, for those of you that aren't aware of how to find all that is the Performance Engineering SIG, you can either go to the Vivid Worldwide homepage and find us, or a short bit.ly link of bit.ly/VividPE. Todd, I think you have the ability to find a couple of questions for us to answer.
Thank you, Chris. This is one of the fun ones where we have a ton of questions that have come in. So I think Chris, Lisa, Mohit, you guys definitely help to get people thinking about a few things. I'm going to start at the top. So Vaven had submitted a question that says, and Mohit, this may be best for you. I know you were talking a little bit about this early on in the webinar, but network performance plays an important role in direct-to-customer or consumer type applications, and this is always a struggle when monitoring network performance. Would like to know from a panelist what their strategy to identify network bottlenecks. And I know, Lisa, as you think about the architecture that you have on ship and some of the unique challenges in that environment when the ships are out and about. I'm sure there's also some bits there to add. But Mohit.
So means talking about network performance monitoring. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have these. I don't manage that space, but I think management perspective, we use some tools. I think that's NetScout. I'm not sure if I have 5 of those, but there are a bunch of tools out there that you just have to make sure you monitor your end user and understand the usage. It's really hard. It's a very complicated task now. Knowing that the user is coming from all these different websites, you can do TCP dumps on various things and look at the details of latency, where the latency issues are. But I'm sure that if he was a network engineer on site, he would probably say his task is very complicated now, because he has to make sure that his back end at least performs well. But you can pretty much, if you're using CDN and stuff, it even becomes much worse if you're using like Amazon CDN, or if you're using the CDNs from like Akamai. They do that for you. I think if you're worldwide, I would recommend that you probably use a CDN, because they would probably have better tools and an understanding of how networks are being used and how your end user is behaving. From my perspective, means I kind of don't have visibility in the network, what is happening on the network, except for when there are issues happening. So when there's an issue, when I go back to the network team, they say, oh, there's no network issue, right? So unfortunately, that's what happens. And oftentimes I cannot find the root cause. Like the example I gave you earlier was that, when we added like 5% of mobile users, and what that did to the whole system, and oftentimes the backend system is pretty much shared between your regular application and also your mobile user. So a 5% spike in your mobile usage could actually crash your whole system, because if you haven't tested it properly, you could actually have an issue with network, and network firewalls or issues on the network where 5 load balancers could cause problems there as well. That's, I think, my kind of what I know from a network perspective. I'm not a network engineer, but I think the monitoring task is definitely very complicated.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mohit, for that. Let's see, Lisa, is there anything that you would want to add around network performance and how maybe you're able to capture these and monitor that, and maybe more importantly, identifying those bottlenecks, and how do you bring those into your different test scenarios?
Well, what we, just to add to what Mohit says, I'm also not, a network profiling specialist, but what we tend to do, we'll bring in those network folks, and they'll monitor with us, especially if we have issues. We bring them in, and they'll perform. They'll put, we'll use a network profiling tool, and no one can kind of sniff the network and understand through trace IPs. They'll actually trace our load injector IPs to the actual target application and understand, where the time's being spent. That's what they'll do to troubleshoot it. From our side, we've also had to move our testing, injector. So actually move an injector if we have to, right in front of the application to understand, is it actually a network issue? On shipboard, it's a unique environment because that network typically a closed network. So what we're faced with is we have priorities based on the type of traffic. And typically all ships across all the cruise lines use one satellite. So that emulates to an experience if they're going out to the World Wide Web of a 55K user. But internally, phone calls take priority. Nautical communications, which are regulatory, right, they take a priority. So we're having to deal with that on ship. So we've used Shamra, as I think, Todd, on board for network capture and monitoring as well, which has helped us a lot. to kind of compress the traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to add one more thing. Like since you're talking about Shinra, I know Shinra and Experience for Network Virtualization has actually capability, has libraries of what happens in different zones, right, which get updated from time to time. So I've actually looked at that in LoadRunner, and we try to use that in some of our testing, and it actually gives us a really good indication of how the performance would be, like if you're in London, and your server's in Boston. So it actually mimics the latency in the system. From a testing perspective, I think we are better. The monitoring time, it's challenging because you just have to figure out, your end users are coming from so many different places. The task is just complicated. From a testing perspective, I think there are tools out there that you can use. I think getting the user data is more complicated.
To add to that, I'm sorry, we've actually, when we have those unique scenarios where we have to identify different peer points, we found it very cost effective to use StormRunner for those scenarios, because we don't have injectors located across the world. We have Amazon injectors that will leverage and scale up, but they're pretty much located in specific sites in the U.S., right? So if we have that international presence that we need to represent, I found StormRunner to be very effective.
Outstanding. Well, I really appreciate your guys' input. I know that we are over a little bit, but I've got two other questions here that I think I can fold together. So let me see if I can kind of put them together here. The first question is, lately most of the clients are requesting on early performance validation. Typically, the performance testing lifecycle takes a lot of time for developing scripts before running them and finding performance issues. I want to get an idea from the panel. What is their take or strategy to shift left and do early performance validation? The second question, which kind of plays together, I believe, is how do you get teams to buy in on the value of performance testing? Most areas see it as a nice to have as opposed to needed. So again, those two pieces there. Chris, I don't know how you would want to divide that up, but I think probably after this one, we'll have to just plan on getting written responses out on the rest of the questions.
I think I would agree, and frankly, those written responses can be helpful as well because it gives you the ability to have that and actually take it away. So let's open up that question and hear about it. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of experience in that area as of yet, but I know that our two awesome panelists do, and I'd like to hear from them.
I could take that on. So we are, like I said, we are agile versus waterfall. So early testing really, I think, would apply in the agile world. But right now, if the way it happens at my company, and we are pretty ingrained in performance testing over here, in the sense of, we kind of get involved in the estimation of projects, looking at high-level architectures, and making judgments based on that. And a lot of it is end-user driven. You know your application is going to be used by so many people. So if it's only 5 people, it's unlikely that you will probably get involved early. Yeah, but if it's anything that's a larger number, then you get involved early. And if it's agile, it's really, you have to step in. You have to get into Scrum meetings. You have to get into the developers as to what they're doing, whether you're just log in. That might be important because you may have many roles in the system. So you want to be able to test that, make sure you can just test that one service layer and provide some feedback and numbers to development teams, which often helps them. That I can't do this, and with the whole DevOps initiative, I know there's LeanFT, there's some other stuff out there from HP and other tools, and LoadRunner also integrates with Jenkins, so which my company is moving to now. And I'm looking forward to automating some of that API testing for people, so that they can actually run this test in their builds and make sure their build quality is improving, because that's one of the challenges we have over here as well. But I think that's really the value comes in. They have reusable scripts, and performance testing is pretty much 90% to 95% automated, right? So it means it's all tool driven. You can't really do it manually. So and that's a big cost saving as well. So it means the development team wants to look at how my service performed under this user, under these boundary conditions, different level of data, so you can give that information to your end user. But really, you have to be proactive as a performance engineer to get involved in those Scrum meetings and ask the right questions. I was in one meeting today, and they actually this role question came into the picture, and they said that, oh, we have this one user which has 25 to 30 roles, and what kind of impact will it have on performance? You know, so that I can test that as soon as possible whenever that code moves in. At least you get some initial numbers. I mean, your database might be really zero in development environments, but you can at least get some initial baseline numbers which you can reuse, which can use to tune your system at least initially. It may need to be retuned when you go to a production-sized database, but getting involved is really up to you.
No, I agree, Mohit. Thank you very much. And a thought I'd offer up to the audience and those listening is, you know, where in regions like that, having hard SLAs due to your hardware architecture isolation is very difficult. You know, what we can always do is we can always utilize trending and trending data for that to understand how a particular release or code push impacted the responsiveness of a particular activity that we have. Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, as there are just an immense amount of moving pieces in the world that you live in? Maybe just a quick moment, and then we will wrap up.
Sure. Very good point about trending. I was actually going to say, you know, proving to your organization that performance testing is important. Trending is a very good way to show that. Showing them the impact, you know, obviously in any organization, they really understand the cost of not doing performance testing as soon as they have a performance issue, right? And it's epic. You know, performance issues aren't like functional issues. They're usually typically epic and can cause major outages. And that's really the justification that you find to your company or your business. But doing trending is, when you're doing performance testing, that's a very good way to kind of prove out the value and the issues that you find. You know, capturing those and statistically reporting those back to the product owner or to, you know, your manager or CIO is a good way to also prove it and understand what the cost of that would have been to production. That's a good way to justify it. Moving more to the left, you know, in our group we have multiple technologies. We have a lot of new technologies they're always introducing. One thing we challenge the software engineering group with is to ensure that they're doing diligence on their side when they're testing agile or waterfall or hybrid or fragile, is to make sure that they're actually using a profiling tool, right? And that they're producing results, and they have a, you know, a foundation or framework, and they're organized in their testing when they're doing this. That we found will help reduce the amount of issues found later on in the process, which actually have a higher cost.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic, and I think that's you know, the one thing I use these webinars for, not only when I you know, help host them, is to use them as a point to kind of excite me about our roadmap that we have for performance engineering and check back every 6-12 months on where I am with it. And I think what Lisa just brought up is huge. You know, trying to drive the knowledge of performance impact down to the development levels. And whether you're there now or in 6 months, 12 months, you know, always trying to continually evolve. Real quick, as we're getting ready to close out, you know, I heard many times, and just in Lisa's last comment, you know, getting manager buy-in. And just a reminder that earlier mentioned in this was a mention of a newly published book, Effective Performance Engineering. And not only is it a short read, a very simple read, but it's something that is a great tool to hand to your management. And let's face it, a free PDF book is pretty enticing. And for a short time, that is going to be free. And, you know, please feel free to check out the slides later for that link. And Todd, I'd like you to just wrap us up if you could. And thanks for everybody listening in today.
That sounds great. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate, again, your leadership of this Vivid Worldwide Performance Engineering SIG. Thank you for hosting this call. Lisa and Mohit, I would also like to thank you for your participation as panelists. This conversation has been fantastic. We've generated a lot of questions, but I think your expertise is absolutely recognized across the board. So again, I want to thank you, Chris, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mohit. On behalf of Vivid Worldwide, I thank you for participating in this webinar. Again, we will be posting a blog. In that blog, you will have a link to a PDF download of this deck. as well as a replay and also a download of the Q&A with the responses. So again, please look for that email. Again, our goal and our mission here is quite simple, which is to get this knowledge and this information out, to share it in the community so that we can all learn and be able to move performance engineering forward in the markets today. On behalf of Vivit Worldwide, thank you again for your participation, and we'll speak to you soon.